A wall that could rewrite New Zealand's past, the Kaimanawa Wall mystery. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. There's a stretch of forest in New Zealand where the ground rises gently, the trees close in, and the air feels heavy in that quiet, ancient way. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. No signs, no dramatic reveal, just moss, stone, and shadow. And then you see it, a wall. Not a pile of rocks, not a landslide, a wall. Flat faces, sharp angles, stones fitted together in a way that immediately triggers that instinct in your brain that says someone did this on purpose. This is the Kaimanawa Wall, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee the implications. The mystery isn't just what it is, it's what it suggests. Because if this structure is artificial, if it was built by human hands, then it doesn't just add a footnote to New Zealand's history. It rewrites the opening chapters entirely. It challenges the timeline of settlement, the story of who arrived when, and what they were capable of. And that's why this wall has been controversial from the moment it entered public awareness. At first glance, the stones look massive, rectangular, and carefully aligned. Some faces are remarkably flat. The joints between blocks appear straight. The angles are close to 90 degrees. That's the part that makes people stop and stare. Nature can do incredible things, but nature usually leaves chaos at the edges. Irregularity, randomness. This looks deliberate. Supporters of the artificial theory argue that the wall resembles ancient masonry found in other parts of the world. Cyclopean stonework, large blocks fitted together without mortar, the kind of construction you see in places like South America or the Mediterranean. And that immediately raises a dangerous question. Who could have built something like this in New Zealand long before recorded history? That's where the idea of pre-Māori settlement comes in. A lost culture, an earlier group, people who arrived, built, and vanished, leaving behind only fragments and rumors. For some, this idea is thrilling. For others, deeply uncomfortable. Because history isn't just about facts, it's about identity, land, legacy, and altering the narrative of who was here first carries real weight. On the other side of the debate, geologists argue that the wall is a natural formation, specifically, a fractured ignimbrite deposit, volcanic rock that cools, cracks, and breaks along plains that can look eerily geometric. They point to similar formations elsewhere, where nature produces shapes that mimic human construction. Columnar basalt, jointed lava flows, straight lines without intention. And they're not wrong. Nature absolutely can produce straight edges. It can produce flat plains. The Earth has no problem with geometry. The question isn't whether nature can do this. The question is whether it did this here. What makes the Kaimanawa Wall so frustrating is that it sits right at the intersection of those possibilities. It's not obviously artificial enough to end the debate, and it's not obviously natural enough to silence it either. It exists in that uncomfortable gray zone where interpretation matters as much as observation. One of the biggest sticking points is excavation, or rather, the lack of it. The wall has never been fully excavated. What we see is just the exposed face. Everything below is still buried, and without digging, without seeing whether the structure continues in a pattern, whether there are foundations, corners, or associated artifacts, the debate stays theoretical. Supporters of excavation argue that this is intentional avoidance. That digging might reveal evidence that contradicts the established historical narrative. Critics argue the opposite. That excavation would be costly, disruptive, and unnecessary for what they consider a settled geological explanation. And that stalemate has allowed the mystery to fester. Another layer to this is Maori oral tradition. Some stories speak of earlier peoples, the Waitaha, who lived in the land before later tribes arrived. Whether those stories describe literal separate populations or symbolic ancestral layers is debated. Oral traditions aren't simple historical records. They're memory, myth, genealogy, and metaphor woven together. But they matter, especially when physical features seem to echo them. If the wall were proven artificial, it wouldn't automatically validate every legend, but it would force historians to re-examine assumptions, to ask whether parts of the story were oversimplified, whether complexity was smoothed out for the sake of clarity. The resistance to that idea isn't necessarily malicious. Academic frameworks are built carefully. They rely on evidence, peer review, and consensus. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And right now, the Kaimanawa Wall doesn't have that proof, but it does have presence. People who visit it often describe a strange feeling. Not mystical, exactly. More like cognitive dissonance. Your eyes tell you one thing. Your training or assumptions tell you another. And your brain doesn't like being stuck between them. There's also the issue of weathering. If this were an ancient wall, thousands of years old, exposed to the elements, how sharp would those edges really be? How intact would the faces look? That question cuts both ways. Supporters argue that burial protected it. Skeptics argue that erosion patterns don't match human masonry. And then there's the silence. No tools found nearby. No carvings, no inscriptions, no associated structures, just the wall. That isolation makes interpretation harder. Context is everything in archaeology. Remove context and even clear evidence becomes ambiguous. What's undeniable is that the Kaimanawa Wall has become more than a geological curiosity. It's a symbol, a focal point for broader questions about how history is constructed, who gets to tell it, and how open we are to revising it. There's a tendency to think of history as a solved puzzle, with only minor details left to fill in. Sites like this remind us that's not true, that some chapters may still be missing, or worse, deliberately ignored because they complicate things. And then there's the emotional response. For some, the idea of a lost civilization is exciting. It adds mystery, depth, drama. For others, it feels like an attack, as if acknowledging earlier peoples somehow diminishes later ones. But history isn't a zero-sum game. The presence of one group doesn't erase another. Still, these debates rarely stay purely academic. They bleed into identity, politics, and belonging. That's why a quiet wall in a forest can generate so much noise. Standing there, looking at those stones, you're struck by how indifferent they are to the argument. They don't explain themselves. They don't defend their origin. They just exist. And in that existence, they force us to confront our own discomfort with uncertainty. The Kaimanawa Wall doesn't shout. It doesn't demand belief. It simply asks a question by its very shape. Was I made, or did I happen? And why does the answer matter so much to you? That question lingers longer than any conclusion. And maybe that's why the wall remains unexcavated. Because once you dig, once you decide, the mystery collapses into an answer. And answers, while satisfying, often end conversations. Mystery keeps them alive. As long as the wall stands partially hidden, partially revealed, it occupies a liminal space between nature and culture, between accident and intention, between what we know and what we think we know. And that space is where the most interesting questions tend to live. What's fascinating is how quickly the debate around the Kaimanawa Wall shifts from stone to story. People start out arguing about geology, but they rarely stay there. The conversation drifts into history, then into identity, then into belief. And that drift says a lot about us, because walls, especially ancient ones, aren't neutral objects. They imply borders, builders, purpose, presence. One of the quieter arguments in favor of the wall being artificial is pattern repetition. Natural fractures tend to vary. They follow stress lines, cooling rates, and material inconsistencies. Human construction, even ancient construction, tends to favor repetition. Similar block sizes, similar angles. Intentional alignment. When people point to the Kaimanawa Wall and say, "That looks built," what they're responding to is that sense of order. Critics counter by pointing out that ignimbrite can fracture in surprisingly regular ways, especially under certain conditions, and they're right. But here's the thing. The debate doesn't hinge on whether nature can do this. It hinges on probability. How likely is it that nature would produce something this suggestive? In this configuration, in this location, that's where excavation becomes unavoidable. Without it, everyone is arguing from the surface. Literally. There's also the matter of orientation. The wall appears to be aligned in a way that isn't random. That could mean nothing, or it could mean something. Alignment matters in human construction, especially ancient construction. Orientation toward landmarks, cardinal directions, or celestial events is common worldwide. Without digging and mapping the full structure, that question remains unanswered. Another underappreciated angle is purpose. If it were a wall, what was it for? Defense? Agriculture? Ritual? Territorial marking? Walls don't exist in isolation. They belong to systems. A wall implies something it enclosed or protected. The absence of surrounding structures is often cited as evidence against human origin. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially in environments where organic materials decay rapidly. Wood rots, earthworks erode, stone lasts. If an ancient structure combined stone with perishable materials, the stone could be all that remains. That's not speculation. That's archaeology. The hesitation to excavate often gets framed as fear of rewriting history, but it might be something more mundane. Bureaucracy, funding, risk. Excavation is expensive. It can damage sites. And if the prevailing consensus is that the wall is natural, then from an administrative standpoint, digging might seem unnecessary. But that creates a feedback loop. It's considered natural because it hasn't been excavated, and it isn't excavated because it's considered natural. That loop is hard to break. Meanwhile, the wall continues to attract attention from people outside academia, independent researchers, enthusiasts, locals, and with that attention comes speculation. Some of it grounded, some of it wildly ungrounded. Lost continents, advanced ancient civilizations, aliens. Those ideas don't help the credibility of the core question, but they thrive in the vacuum left by uncertainty. It's easy to dismiss the entire topic because of those extremes, but doing so risks throwing out legitimate questions along with the noise. Not every mystery leads to a revolutionary discovery. Some lead to clearer confirmation of what we already know. Both outcomes are valuable. What's striking is how emotionally charged the conversation becomes. That's usually a sign that something deeper is at stake. If this were just a pile of rocks, no one would care. The fact that people do care tells you that the wall touches something sensitive. The story of origins, the story of belonging. New Zealand's history is relatively recent compared to other parts of the world, at least in terms of recorded human settlement. That makes any suggestion of deep antiquity feel disruptive. It challenges a clean narrative, and clean narratives are comforting, but the world is rarely clean. Even if the wall turns out to be entirely natural, the debate around it has already served a purpose. It has reminded people that history is provisional, that interpretations change, that certainty should be held lightly, and if someday excavation reveals something unexpected, then history expands, not collapses. Expands. The Kaimanawa Wall also raises questions about how we classify knowledge. Geological explanations and archaeological interpretations operate in different domains. When they overlap, friction is inevitable, but that friction can be productive if handled honestly. Standing back, it's worth remembering that humans have been wrong before, confidently wrong. Entire theories have fallen apart under new evidence. That doesn't mean skepticism is bad. It means humility is essential. The wall doesn't need to be ancient masonry to matter, and it doesn't need to be natural formation to be uninteresting. Its value lies in what it reveals about how we approach the unknown. Do we investigate carefully, or do we dismiss quickly? Do we listen to multiple perspectives, or do we cling to the first explanation that fits our worldview? The forest around the wall will keep growing. Moss will keep spreading. The stones will keep weathering. Long after the current debate fades, the structure will still be there, unchanged by our arguments. In that sense, the Kaimanawa Wall is patient. It doesn't care whether it's called natural or artificial. It waits, and waiting is something stone does very well. What lingers after thinking about it isn't frustration, but curiosity. A quieter, more durable kind. The kind that doesn't demand answers immediately. The kind that's willing to sit with ambiguity. Maybe one day, someone will dig. Maybe they won't. Either way, the wall will continue to exist at the edge of explanation. And that's not a failure of knowledge. It's a reminder of its limits. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can say about the past is also the simplest. We don't know. And we're still learning how to ask the right questions. The Kaimanawa Wall doesn't force a conclusion. It invites a conversation. And as long as that conversation continues, the wall remains alive in a way few stones ever are.